biblical interpreters are always debating about the Bible, saying, this or that event, did that really happen, or is that just a myth? The historicity of the Bible has been debated for some time, but my belief is that behind most myths are a legend, and behind the legend is a story in the distant past told about something that actually happened. And today's reading in the Old Testament is one of everybody's favorite stories. And there are a lot of details in this story of David and Goliath, which lead us to believe that this was the fight that was actually fought. And if you read the whole passage, the whole chapter, as Rhonda almost did, you'll discover even more details about the life of David as a shepherd. We like to root for the underdog. And the usual interpretation of this story is that God chooses the most unlikely of people to do his work. And I see it a little differently. God chooses the people who look unlikely to us, the people, seeing by sight, and not by faith. The people that God chooses are the perfect people for the job. They just don't appear to us to be that way. And the second thing is that, like David, we don't need all that armor. So let's look at the story of David and Goliath. And here's the setting. All the cities of ancient Israel are in mountainous country. Not mountains like we have, but at least high ground. And the Philistines were people that originally were Cretan. They came from Crete. And they were seafaring people that had settled on the Mediterranean coast north of Israel. Between the coast and the high ground, there are a series of valleys that run north-south that provide access from the coast up to the higher ground. And the Philistines decide, because they are the great enemy of Israel, they decide that they're going to go up one of these valleys and divide Israel in half, divide and then conquer. Now Saul gets wind of this, and he sends his army down to meet the Philistines. And at the beginning of this passage, the situation is that each army is on a ridge with a valley in between. And they've been there in a stalemate for weeks, because neither can attack the other, because you would have to go down the ridge, across the valley, and then up into the teeth of the other army, which would be a disaster. So nobody's doing anything. And finally the Philistines say, well, let's settle this by single combat. And that was something that happened quite frequently in ancient times. You would have two champions who would duke it out. Whoever survived, that was the victor. And so it was a way of solving a problem without killing a lot of people and a lot of bloodshed. And so that's what the Philistines do. They say, let's have our two champions out here. Well, the Philistine has their champion is Goliath. Now, by the standards of the day, he was a giant, 6'9". Now, to put that in a modern context, that's shorter than Charles Barkley, but not as big as Shaquille O'Neal, and a whole lot smaller than Andre the Giant. But in a time when the average warrior would have been 5'6", 5'7", that was giant enough. And he probably suffered from the same disease that Andre did that made him so large. But in that time, even somebody my size would have been considered something of a giant. So here's this guy, 6'9". And nobody in Saul's army wants to fight him. It's sudden death. Until David says, "Here I am." And Saul says, "That's impossible. You're just a boy. You can't fight that behemoth." And David says, "Oh, look, I'm a shepherd. I've killed lions and bears with my sling. I have to protect my sheep. I'm up for it." And remember, too, that the Spirit of the Lord is mightily upon David. And besides, what choice does Saul have? So Saul says, "Okay, go fight Goliath. But first, here, take this armor." Now, this always reminds me of that scene in the Return of the King, where Gimli the dwarf is given this chainmail to put on. It's about 3 feet too long, and it winds up in this pile at his feet. Well, that's kind of what happened with David. He says, "I can't move. How can I fight?" So he gets rid of the armor, and what he takes is his shepherd's staff. He picks up 5 stones, he puts them in his shepherd's bag, and he takes his sling. Now, this is not a slingshot. It's not a children's toy. A sling was a leather pouch with 2 cords attached to it. You put a lead ball or a stone in the pouch, and then you'd swing it like this. About 6 or 7 times a second is how fast you'd swing it. And then you release one of those cords, and the projectile goes out at a speed of about the speed of a major league fastball. And it had the stopping power of a .45 handgun. It's not a toy. Now, the ancient armies were divided into cavalry, that's the chariots, heavy infantry, that was Goliath. A lot of armor, but good only for fighting in close. And then you had the artillery. You wonder, how did they have artillery back then? Well, the slingers and the archers were the artillery of the day. And the slingers were much more effective than the archers because they were able to hit a target at 200 yards. They could hit a bird flying in midair. The sling was a serious weapon meant for distance, as opposed to what Goliath had, which was just for fighting up close. Which is why Goliath, when he sees David, says, "Come up close so that I may feed you to the birds of the air," etc. But if David doesn't come up close, he can't do that. This is a case of artillery versus infantry. The very thing that made Goliath appear to be so fearsome, his size and his armor, in fact, made him weak against his opponent. He didn't stand a chance against David. Not a chance. But that's not the way Saul saw it. He was going by appearances. So he says, "Here, take this armor." And in fact, that's not the way anyone saw it. I mean, nobody was going to fight this guy. Nobody knew except God, who doesn't look at appearances. He knew David the way he knows every one of us. He sees our hearts. He doesn't notice our outer appearance. He knows our strengths. He knows our weaknesses. And he knows that some of the things we think of as our strengths are, in fact, our weaknesses. Just like Goliath. He thought he was invincible. But what he thought made him invincible made him a target. We armor ourselves with the masks that we wear, the faces we show to the world in different situations. We build up this impenetrable ego with all the devices we use to ward off that which we fear might hurt us. But David was right. You don't need all that armor. You can put the armor aside. You, like David, have the Spirit of God to come to your aid. Nor do you need to be dismayed by the world of appearances, by all the masks worn in this world. Behind the armor, Goliath was as vulnerable as anybody. If you go by appearances, the obstacles can seem larger than they are. And then we wonder if there's any power that can deal with that obstacle. We start to forget about God. But in the words of the psalmist, the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. So do you put your trust in God? Do you seek him in times of trouble? Do you see the world as it is with the eyes of faith, not of sight? Paul writes to the Corinthians, we urge you also not to accept the grace of God in vain. For he says, at an acceptable time I have listened to you, and on a day of salvation I have helped you. See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation. He is saying, God has done all the work for us. By the grace of God, by nothing you have done, you have been saved by God's action in this world. Don't waste what has freely been given to you. Now is the time to respond. For if the Corinthians and us do not respond to the saving work of God, all that work and the labors of Paul and all those who went after him, all will go for nothing. It would be as though David, upon whom the Lord has mightily set his spirit, it's as though he had said, thanks God, but do you see the size of that guy? I'm out of here. Paul is saying, don't waste what God has given you. We need not fear giants, whether the beast within or the beast without. And we need not fear any storm that besets us if we truly trust God. Now, Tomas and I were restoring my 40-year-old sailboat because we're going to be sailing it in local waters. Local waters can be treacherous, winds and so on. This is not the easiest place to sail a small boat. So we want her to be as able, as well found as possible. But any boat, no matter how you trust her, has her limits. Now some of you have boats, and some of you have been out in those boats in nasty weather. Our last boat was a 22-foot British sailboat, which had been sailed across the Atlantic by a man and his 12-year-old daughter. So it was good for anything. But I got caught on 2 different occasions in a gale off coast. And, you know, in the midst of all that wind and the high waves and your little boat, what you most think is that if anything breaks, I'm in trouble. No matter how good the boat is, it has its limits just like you do. And the boat and you can be overwhelmed. In Mark, we read that after a long day of teaching, Jesus decided to cross the Sea of Galilee. The disciples take their exhausted rabbi, they put him in the boat. We don't quite know what "just as he was" means. There are some who say he was exhausted and was already asleep and they just lifted him up and stuck him in the boat. I'm not sure what that means. But it must have been something like that. And because he's sound asleep and the storm is rising and he's unaware of it. He sleeps right through it. Until the disciples cry out, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And Jesus calms the storm. "Why are you afraid? Why have you still no faith?" He's asking, why aren't you trusting in God? God does care for us. Of course he does. And he will calm the storms of your life if you are open to him. Paul said to the Corinthians, "Our heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children. Open wide your hearts also." We have to be open to God. That's a necessary precursor to faith. We have to let God in. And since we are to love our neighbors, then we have to be open to them as well. We have to use the eyes of faith and not simply of sight to see beyond the masks of the world to the reality behind those masks. Because God loves every one of us. As Paul says, whatever hardship you encounter, as you are faithful, go into the world with nothing but the trust of God. That's all you need. As the world sees you, you may be seen as weak. Paul says, we are treated as imposters, and yet are true. That is, we're true to God. We're the real thing because we are in God's kingdom. Put aside your armor and respond to the grace of God and his work of salvation. As Paul puts it, by leading a life of purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapon of righteousness for the right hand and for the left. That sounds like a pretty big order, doesn't it? But such character doesn't come from your trying to be good. It flows out of you inevitably if you are open to God. And those weapons are the only ones you'll ever need. What does God ask of you? You are no more unlikely a servant of God than David or Peter or Paul if you open your heart to God and see the world with the eyes of faith. So as you leave today, remember the words of Paul. I speak as to children. Open wide your hearts. Amen.